Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar. Presenting today is Andrew Costis, otherwise known as AC at LogRhythm. He's a threat research engineer in the LogRhythm Labs team, and he's going to be addressing how to incorporate threat hunting into your security. So before we get started, if you have any questions during the presentation, submit them through the questions feature in the BrightTalk interface. And then at the end of the presentation, we can go to as many questions as we can. Okay. So these are the things we're going to be covering today. But before we start, we're going to start with a vote. So we're going to ask you in the audience to vote on question 1, which is threat hunting just industry hype? So you can vote yes, no, or if you're not sure, or you can reserve judgment until after the webinar today. And while you're voting, I'm going to hand over to AC to give us a definition of threat hunting. Over to you, AC.
Yeah, good morning, Laura. Thanks, everyone, for joining today's session. So just while everyone's answering that question, I will obviously begin with a definition of what threat hunting is. So the actual term threat hunting actually came from the US Air Force, but actually it was kind of coined the term hunter-killer. But probably the best and more sort of recent definition came out of a paper, a SANS article that was written by Rob Lee back in 2016. And just a couple of kind of key sentences really to define what threat hunting is all about. So threat hunting is a focused and iterative approach to search out, identifying and understanding adversaries that have entered the defender's networks. Threat hunting is an analyst-driven process that is meant to address issues outside of what a single alert or indicator can reveal. So we can kind of glean quite a lot from just those couple of sentences. And the reason why threat hunting has really kind of come into the spotlight over the last year or so is that the whole defensive mindset or historically has typically been more reactive as opposed to proactive. And that's where the idea of threat hunting is introduced, because it's this change of methodology and this change of mindset going from the reactive stance to a more proactive stance. And I think before we continue, Laura's probably going to call out the results of that first round of question that we just put to the vote. So over to you, Laura.
We are indeed. Thanks, AC. Right then, so we've had a good number of votes from the audience, and 75% of you believe that threat hunting is not just industry hype. A few of you are reserving judgment. 6% say that it is, and 6% of you are not sure. So, AC, what do you think about that then? Are you surprised that the majority believe that it's not just industry hype?
I actually am, and that's quite refreshing, because I think if you went back if you did the same vote maybe a year ago or possibly even 6 months ago, certainly to some people that I've spoken to over the last year, I think the industry is very is very good at buzzwords and industry hype, but that's quite refreshing to hear that people's perception is actually the fact that they're taking this seriously, and threat hunting is at least here to stay potentially for the long term. So yeah, quite pleased with those results actually, Laura.
Good. Now, I know that we're all wanting to get into the presentation, but we have one more vote, and you've got loads of time to vote on this one. So the next question, I'm just going to start the voting for you all. What is the main reason you might not be threat hunting currently in your organization? So some of you may be already, or some may not have technology to do it, or you don't have the resources or the time, or all of the above. So whilst you're voting, AC, it is over to you.
All right, thanks, Laura. So yeah, we're going to so we've defined what threat hunting is, kind of high level. So now we're going to move into some of the reasons as to why should we care and why threat hunting is becoming more and more important for the organizations out there. So we all read the news every single day. We know that there's an underground or a black market that exists for malware, databases, login credentials, RDP sessions, and there's very much almost an eBay equivalent of auctions that are going on underground, selling access to systems all over the world within organizations. There was a report titled 2017 Cost of Data Breach Study carried out by an independent research company that claims that the average days or number of days to identify the data breach was 191 days in 2017. That's actually come down over recent years, but it's still got quite a way to go. And I don't know if anyone recalls, but there was a hacker that hacked into almost quite a difficult target. So that there was a guide that was posted on Pastebin about how this hacker broke into a company which was effectively a spy company used for government purposes called Hacking Team. And this hacker, one thing that really stood out to me was that they claimed, and I quote, almost all of the Fortune 500 with their huge networks have some bots already inside their network. Now, take that as you will, but there certainly seems to be, a growing confidence level with the attackers and the adversaries out there. So not only do we have the attackers for trying to target organizations for their individual needs, but we also have, as we're all aware, nation-state sponsored attackers. So various countries and dedicated resources all over the world with specific APT specifics that are targeting critical infrastructure and certain verticals. So moving into some recent survey results that SANS performed, and I'm not going to kind of drill into this too much, but out of a sample size of about 300 or so recipients or respondents, just some positive reasons that came out of their survey. So just some of them were obviously measurable improvements in security, improvements in speed and accuracy of response by performing threat hunting, and obviously reducing their exposures. And we'll kind of go into some of these reasons a bit later on in this presentation. But just as a validation, and obviously SANS being a reputable vendor company out there, it's good to know that the respondents are at least reporting some pretty, pretty positive feedback. So I want to touch on this particular graphic. So some of you may have seen this before. So this graphic was created by a chap called David Bianco, and it's called the Pyramid of Pain. And the idea behind this graphic is to measure the usefulness of your threat intelligence. It measures the difficulty obtaining that intelligence. So in other words, so how I would interpret this graphic is that if you are able to prevent artifacts higher up the pyramid, so for example tools and TTPs, then the harder you're going to make it for the adversary to keep coming back with further assaults. And so the reason for that is looking at the lower end of the pyramid. So if we talk about hash values and IP addresses, particularly around nation-state sponsored attacks, targeted attacks, those infrastructure artifacts, for example, domain names and IPs, or even hash values, have generally a very short shelf life. So in other words, if a piece of malware manages to get into an organization, and let's say a sysadmin or even an internal user, finds a malicious file, but they don't know it's malicious, so they just decide maybe to upload it to VirusTotal. The malware author at the other end potentially is going to get alerted or notified that that sample has been uploaded, and therefore they're going to change their tactics and tools and procedures. They may send down a C2 command to alter the actual malware that sits on the file system. They may change their C2 infrastructure, so they may bring down domain names and IPs, move them or transition them over to a new infrastructure. So it's very hard in a world where we have so much threat intelligence out there, and there's lots of great free and commercial threat intelligence feeds out there. But the whole idea and usefulness of this graphic is if you can prevent or at least try and stop the artifacts at the higher end of the pyramid, then it's just essentially going to make the repetitiveness of their efforts to try and get into your network much more difficult. And a quick example of this, so if we just take something very simple that we all understand, so an IP address can actually be represented in many different ways. And that's by design as part of most modern operating systems. So you can type a domain name like google.com or securityweekly.com in this example into a web browser, or you could also use the DNS equivalent IP address that maps to that domain name. But in addition, you can also use decimal, octal, and even hexadecimal, and even a combination into a standard web browser and still reach google.com or whatever the domain name is. And that's just a very simplistic idea of ways that attackers can obfuscate, legitimate looking domains and IPs and so on. So that's why when we talk about the pyramid of pain, that does have quite a lot of bearing in terms of the mindset behind threat hunting. So not to drill in too deep into maturity models, but it's definitely worth a mention. So in terms of threat hunting, and the maturity models on the left and right, so the one on the left is the COBIT maturity model, and the one on the right is the LogRhythm maturity model. And there's probably other variations of the maturity model, but the whole idea really is that the more mature or the more mature end of the scale that your organization is in terms of the approach to security, then potentially you're going to be better positioned for threat hunting. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to be able to do threat hunting if you're on the lower end, but it's just going to mean that you have more of the cogs in motion so that your life is going to be made much easier. And you can kind of drill into these perhaps offline and look at the specifics to see what you need to do to get to the sort of the far right end of the maturity models. But ultimately, you're going to be, as I say, in a better position. And also, if you're going to be more reactive to security incidents, then you're not going to be swamped and overburdened by, day-to-day incidents that you might have to investigate. So therefore, with threat hunting and how that fits in, is you're going to be able to spend ultimately more time and resources with your hunting. So moving on to some other reasons for threat hunting. So one of the things that I've personally seen a lot in this industry is there's a lot of competition between, security analysts, moving between companies. We all know that there's a skills shortage globally for people going into InfoSec. And, one of the things I think that's really positive that comes out of threat hunting is that if you have a defensive team of people, and maybe they're just getting a bit bored, responding to their alarms and incidents every day, and maybe they're looking for something a bit more refreshing. I think threat hunting really serves a purpose, because the idea of threat hunting is that not only do you think as a defender, but you have to be able to think like an attacker. And this is where potentially skills come in, where perhaps people have had a little bit of exposure to both sides of that picture and not just one. So from a staff retention point of view, I think threat hunting has definitely got a place. But that said, you need to ensure that you have the right skills and the right people dedicated to threat hunting. Threat hunting also does increase visibility on your network. So as an example, how would you know whether maybe there's some suspicious or potentially malicious activity going on if you're not actually actively going out and checking those key areas of your network? So as an example, perhaps a server that has some sort of performance or health issue may only be investigated, and potentially not even at the security level, but more of an operational level, when that particular server or service or application running on that server maybe has a bit of a wobble in terms of reliability. This is where threat hunting can really serve its purpose, because through a hunt that you might be looking for something specific after forming a hypothesis of what you're looking for, you might end up on your hunting travels actually exposing something that you might not have otherwise been aware of. So again, it's increasing visibility into parts of your network that you may not have otherwise been aware of. fully utilizing, or are you fully utilizing all of your security products? So again, lots of competition, lots of great vendors out there that have, great products, and it's all very well having them, but actually you're not necessarily always going to be fully utilizing them if you're only using them for a certain task, and particularly in the realms of kind of typical defense and reactiveness or reactive defense, you might only be scratching the surface of some of those security tools. So increasing your return of investment by performing hunting, the chances are you're going to increase the usage of those tools. And we'll kind of cover a little bit more about how automation can come in by building out automation based on your results after your post-hunting activities. And just a final point on this slide. So typically incidents that I've worked on and I've spoken to people about in the past, incidents can be very time sensitive, high pressure situations that require answers, not just at the technical level, but at the C level, trying to uncover the answers as quickly as possible. And I have seen from time to time, mistakes being made because everyone's in a rush and everyone's in a state of panic. The idea with hunting is that you actually kind of take your time, and obviously you can't have an infinite amount of time to perform your hunting activities, but ultimately if you're hunting, you tend to have a little bit more time and therefore less pressure on the people performing the hunts. And this generally helps to kind of dissect, parts of your network, or whether it's your network traffic or host behavior and so on. Then, this is another great benefit of threat hunting. So going to move on to some of the requirements now of threat hunting. So I often hear, particularly around threat hunting, that all of the logs are required. And that kind of always makes me chuckle because, yeah, while that might be useful, it's not necessarily a requirement. And the one thing that people need to factor in when they consider collecting all of the logs is actually that has a cost on performance and processing, storage, infrastructure, and transport of that log data. So I would caveat all the logs by, on this, as shown on this slide here, is actually saying all of the useful logs, because there's no point collecting log data from, maybe quite a rare or obscure log source if that particular log source just isn't designed to send anything of particular interest. So I'd be very mindful of, in terms of threat hunting, that you are collecting only your useful log data. And that also includes network traffic and flow data as well, because the more visibility you have, and if we talk about the OSI blueprint of OSI layers 2 to 7, the more layers that you are collecting from the network and data link layers up to the sort of the application layers, then you're going to have more forensic artifacts available to aid with your hunting. You also need to have data normalization, classification, and prioritization. So probably something that LogRhythm kind of do out of the box, but for other organizations out there that might be using elk stacks or some other kind of bespoke or custom implementation of their own log collection or SIM platform. But this is something that is so key, and not only just being able to classify and normalize that data and give it a risk score or rating, but actually be able to kind of keep on top of that as well. As new log sources are added, making sure that checks are being done to ensure that that data is still effectively clean. Now, I've kind of touched on the SIM, but also in terms of AI and machine learning, we know that AI and machine learning is going to greatly enhance your overall hunting experience and efficiency, because most of the foundation work would have already been done. So machine learning applies statistics and algorithms, for example, at scale on large amounts of data sets. And so with supervised and unsupervised learning, this eventually will lead to artificial intelligence where some of the decision making can become automated. This helps with making decisions, and not only that, but also helps with threat intelligence, the analysis section or phase, and also avoidance of alarm fatigue. And so this, again, kind of all ties back, or at least in part, to when I was talking about maturity models, and being able to implement some of these kind of prerequisites just kind of will help, make life a little bit easier. So I touched on threat intelligence earlier, and that there are, very many decent, both free and commercial threat intelligence feeds out there. And similar to how I mentioned about useful logs, really, in terms of threat intelligence, you need to have relevant intelligence. So thinking about threat intelligence that's relevant to your organization. If you're a finance company, you may only be interested, probably you should only be interested in threat intelligence to do with your industry or sector that you work in. You can quite easily be inundated with threat intelligence feeds, and there's not much benefit of just having, unlimited amount of threat intelligence feeds coming in, because ultimately it will become inefficient to search and use that data in a kind of meaningful way. So relevant threat intelligence is really beneficial when you're talking about hunting, and also just as a general tip, really. You also need to consider your network architecture. So thinking about where your critical intellectual property resides in your network. So for example, and this goes back to threat hunting and thinking like an adversary or an attacker, if you were an attacker, where would the kind of the keys of the kingdom live in your network? What might be some entry points into your network? And also thinking about possible pivot points. So, the attacker may not necessarily get direct access to, some critical development server, for instance, or some accounting server, but there may be a number of systems in a path that they may be able to pivot off. And so thinking about not only the intellectual property and where that lives in your organization, but also paths to and from, and just general data flow in and out of your networks will all help in understanding your sort of day-to-day operations for your organization. And I honestly recommend that you kind of review this regularly, because, there are often, new services or applications or infrastructure changes, within a lot of organizations that, happen quite regularly. So making sure that you stay on top of this is really important to, again, helping hunting become more efficient as well. You also need a way of tracking your hunting activities. So this could be some sort of ticketing system that perhaps you already use for other purposes, some sort of case management tracking system, but ultimately you need to be able to track, what it is that you're hunting for, and potentially other variables such as who's performing the hunting, or who, which members of your team are actively working on this particular hunting exercise, as well as the ability to add evidence, add case notes, maybe set SLAs, and that, any other variables that might be pertinent to, hunting in general. And lastly, for requirements, so talking about scripts and playbooks, ultimately, if you're hunting for a certain activity, and if you come back and decide to hunt for that same whatever hypothesis that you formed 6 months later, ideally, if you can, have really well written notes, clearly defined notes, then ultimately that's going to help potentially build out playbooks and, really good documentation for future hunts. So rather than have to go back to the beginning, particularly if people leave your company, it just saves a huge amount of time. So, researching a particular threat and actually how that hunt was performed for your organization and being able to build out documentation will just kind of avoid having to, cover those kind of foundation steps that were done at a previous time. So definitely make sure that you have lots of documentation as you go through your hunting. So we can't have a presentation without talking about another buzzword, which is kill chains, probably way overused. But in relation to threat hunting, kill chains can actually be pretty useful because one of the common questions that we get asked is, where do I start hunting? So I've kind of covered some of that already, talking about threat intelligence feeds, but in relation to threat hunting, kill chains can be quite useful because it can actually help you to focus on particular phases of the kill chain. So for instance, you may only be interested in looking at actions on objectives or the exploitation phase, and it will depend, between organizations what it is ultimately that they're interested in preventing. The bottom graphic is actually LogRhythm's own implementation of the kill chain. So we call this the attack lifecycle. And how this can potentially aid LogRhythm customers is that we have AI engine rules or detection rules that are grouped by category into one of those 6 attack lifecycle stages. So if you're not sure where to start, a general tip would be maybe either look at the attack lifecycle stage or kill chain stage if you're not a LogRhythm customer, but also look at the individual rules that sit within those attack lifecycle stages. And then you can perhaps use that to drive your hypothesis on what you want to look for. So again, just some general things to think about for deciding what to hunt and requirements. So you can either take 2 approaches in general. You can either focus your hunts on network traffic or network data, flow data, PCAP data, or you can focus on specific host activity as well. So these might be application level activities, operating systems, and so on. And obviously you can do a hybrid of the 2. But again, if you're not sure where to start, I would kind of consider what it is it would be particularly useful for starting out your hunting activities. Generally speaking, the low-hanging fruit typically comes from looking at network traffic type of data. So looking for activities going out of unknown ports or maybe to, unknown IP addresses or suspicious IP addresses. And generally that type of low-hanging fruit can help with hunts. And again, just you can glean quite a lot of knowledge by looking at your network data or even your host data. You need to have, and again, not to kind of sound too repetitive, but again, kind of going back to the maturity models, you need to have an understanding of your network, and not only that, but also your security analytics. So understanding your top and bottom X of particular hosts or network or authentication logs or whatever it might be, and also understanding the trends of your systems, having baselines, so being able to spot what's kind of out of the ordinary. That it always comes back to that old adage of you don't know what you don't know, but the more you try and learn what's occurring on your network or within your organization, then this is again going to help play a part in being able to differentiate between something that might look benign versus something that is in fact malicious. And when I step through my example coming up shortly, we'll kind of see where some of this kind of fits in as well in a practical example. And just one last point as well. So kind of similar to the attack lifecycle, I'm sure many of you have heard of the MITRE attack matrix. It's really, really useful. If you've not heard of it, go and check it out. And also JP-Cert. So JP-Cert released something like a 100-page PDF or thereabouts to do with detecting lateral movement within Windows event logs. Again, these are great places to kind of begin your, focus your hunting efforts on. So looking at tools that live off the land, as the saying goes, so things like WMIC or PowerShell can, understanding how attackers, and certainly the more sophisticated attackers, are using these tools that come shipped with, Windows operating systems or other operating systems. So understanding and being able to interpret things like JP-Cert and the attack matrix are, again, going to just help drive some of your hypotheses and going out and actively performing your hunting. So just last point now before we move into our second question results. So just a few things in terms of challenges. So C-level, management level buy-in. So effectively, if you're a decision maker or you need to report to a decision maker about this idea of threat hunting and perhaps you need more resources to go and do it, potentially it could be rejected because you're effectively trying to sell them the idea that you need more cash or more resources to go out and find something, yet there's no guarantee that you're going to find anything. And I mean, I would probably argue that by saying that the fact that the average time to detect is still quite high, the chances are you're going to find something within, less than, a couple of hundred days of detection. So, if you're going to be hunting, particularly on a more full-time basis, the likelihood is you will find something eventually within probably only a few months, if not less. And I would also say that there is no such thing, in my opinion, as an unsuccessful hunt, because even if you don't necessarily find any, malicious evidence that something has happened on a security level, that doesn't necessarily mean that the hunt was unsuccessful, because the chances are you're going to learn quite a lot about your internal operations, maybe even from a people or a management point of view, or even a technical point of view. So that's kind of some of the challenges that you could kind of argue back with. And then I kind of touched on this earlier. You do need to have technically sharp people that can think like an attacker as well as a defender. So you really need to have people that can see it from both sides of the coin and potentially have those skills, or at least be willing to learn those skills as well. Kind of going back to the case management or ticketing systems, ideally you don't want to, I don't think anyone would have the luxury to spend infinite amount of time doing threat hunting activities. But it can become resource intensive, because you could start out looking for one particular artifact or type of attack, and it could, the story can unravel quite quickly, and you might find something else, which then could lead to something else, and so on. So you generally want to kind of limit your time that you spend and try and plan your threat hunting activities really well, because it's just going to make kind of time and resource usage much more efficient. And probably the last time I'll say this now, but it does rely on clean log and network data and a solid interpretation and understanding. So it kind of goes back to my points about data classification, risk scoring, making sure you're collecting useful data, and ultimately that you're regularly checking that data or log data for cleanliness, making sure that your data is is effectively being presented to you in the way that you're expecting it to be presented. And I think we'll go back to Laura now for the results.
Yeah, thank you very much, AC. So while AC's been presenting, we've had a really excellent amount of votes from the audience, and the main reason, 43% of people are currently threat hunting, and 18% don't have the technology to enable them. 25% don't have the resources to dedicate to it, and 6% each for no time or all of the above. So, AC, probably a good thing that 43% are threat hunting. What do you think about the rest of the results?
Interesting results, Laura. So in terms of no technology, I mean, funnily enough, on the most basic level of threat hunting, you don't actually need any security tools. If you have one system on your network and it has, perhaps it's running either Windows, then it's going to have an event viewer log file, or if it's a Linux file, it's going to have, various varlog messages files. And actually, threat hunting can actually be done with no security tools whatsoever. But that said, it can be extremely complicated and very much a manual process of doing threat hunting, because it would require, hopping on to potentially multiple systems, collecting data from multiple systems, analyzing that data and trying to correlate and build out a timeline manually is not impossible, but it can be done. So for the ones, so for the responders that sort of claim that it's mainly the technology or lack of technology, I would certainly look at what technology you do have. I mean, I've even seen people that just actually go out and script a lot of their hunting manually, rather than using security tools, just to try and keep it separate. So there is definitely no right or wrong way of threat hunting, but ultimately, again, not to sound too repetitive, if you're kind of at the generally more mature end of the maturity model, and if you do, the more access to security tools that you have, it's just going to make life a lot easier. And I think the last statistic around no resources or not enough resources, I would look to see for those respondents, I would be asking questions as to why the time isn't available for threat hunting, and where is that time being spent? Is it that they're experiencing alarm fatigue in their SOC? And if so, what's the reason for that? Because if they're receiving alarm fatigue, then perhaps it just requires some tuning of some of the detection rules in place. Perhaps they're monitoring, certain scenarios that don't necessarily need to be monitored, or maybe even there's not enough or adequate amount of automation that's been set up to help to respond with whatever it is that's causing that kind of burden on the resources. So that's kind of my line of thinking, Laura, is really just where is that time being spent? And actually, just as a just as a cheap shot here, so we do actually offer a co-pilot service for LogRhythm customers, and for anyone that's not aware of that, this is ultimately to help assist those customers that perhaps don't have the time or resources to spend, helping tune out their LogRhythm deployment, for instance, and I'm sure other vendors do the equivalent as well.
All right, thanks very much, AC. Some really good practical advice there for the audience. So we're going to do another vote just at the end of the presentation today. And if you have any questions at this point, please do submit them using your questions feature on your interface. But we're going to move into the next part of the presentation. So AC, it's over to you.
All
again.
right, thanks. Thanks, Laura. So so we're going to kind of use a very simplified example of a hunt. And, I've mentioned some of the ways. So, we can use the kill chain, the JP cert, the MITRE attack matrix. We can look at TTPs or tools if we think back to the pyramid of pain. Lots of different ways of forming a hypothesis. So I'm just going to keep this example really simple. And what we're going to effectively do is, and we're just using the LogRhythm tool, and this doesn't necessarily have to be done within the LogRhythm platform. If you have any other tool or ticketing system, for instance, or as I say, even if you're manually doing threat hunting, the concept is similar. So forming the hypothesis in this example, we're going to be looking for internal PS-exec usage across sysadmins. So PS-exec, for those less technical on this call, is just effectively a sysadmin tool that's been used for quite a few years now to remotely run and execute processes on a remote machine. So it's not uncommon for sysadmins to use PS-exec, but it's also become more common in recent times for PS-exec and other utilities that come, packaged out of the box for various operating systems to be used for malware and ransomware attacks, such as NotPetya and Gotcha, that both used PS-exec. So, kind of starting off simple, we're just going to search for process exec under the process name. And we're going to kind of look initially at some common events. So on this slide, we can see that we see some processes and services started and stopping on a particular host machine. So we might not think too much of that at this stage. So we're going to just kind of carry on. And interestingly, from a reactive point of view, perhaps you might have an alarm already configured for PS-exec, and perhaps people working in your SOC might just look at that first slide. In fact, if I just go back to make it a bit easier. So some people might just potentially look at the first results and say, yeah, that's fine, we know who that user is, or we know who that host is, and just close the case. And this is where threat hunting really comes into its own, because again, going back to the fact that you have more time available and less pressure, you're going to probably, and not always, but probably just carry on digging and digging and digging. So for the purpose of this example, that's exactly what we're going to do. So as we move in, we're going to decide to pivot. So using the pivot field, and this really is useful, being able to do this within our dashboard. But again, it's effectively just a way of going backwards or forwards in time. So what we're going to do is we're going to go forward in time, because we know that some PS-exec process started and stopped on that particular machine. So we want to know what happened after that process executed. So we get our results back again. So looking at this particular slide, we can see in our results quite a few different commands and hosts and so on. So we might then think, well, what might be suspicious? And again, perhaps from an instant response perspective, maybe they will kind of carry on digging at this level. But kind of closer inspection, we can see some processes there like cmd.exe and so on executing. So interestingly, PS-exec can execute cmd.exe. So, but why is it executing on the domain controller? And particularly Hostname.exe was executed on the domain controller. So we'll carry on our hunting. And I mean, I'm not going to, it just wasn't practical to include every single step of the investigation, but just the important part. So looking a bit closer, we can see here some event ID 1 created by Sysmon, which shows us some process cmd.exe being started up on our domain controller. So interesting. So what we know so far is that on a particular sysadmin machine, they executed PS-exec and executed Hostname.exe on a domain controller. Well, that could potentially be completely legitimate and absolutely benign. And again, from a kind of SOC perspective or response perspective, this might be as far as the investigation leads. So at this point, the alarm or case may be closed out, and nothing to worry about. But we're going to keep digging. So we look a bit further, and what we find is that also, as well as Hostname.exe, we see another executable called Procdump, which for the technical people, they would know that Procdump is another Microsoft utility used for troubleshooting processes and generally collecting remote process memory dumps of that running process. So again, could be seen as benign, a sysadmin logging into a domain controller, collecting host name, and perhaps collecting some sort of process information for, maybe troubleshooting an issue on the domain controller. So kind of carry on digging, and we see some Sysmon log activity with process started. Again, just a further validation of cmd.exe executing on the domain controller. So what we know so far is pretty much what I've covered. So what we then do is we might find this a bit suspicious or not, but it's probably a good idea to add the logs to this particular case. And again, we're just using our case management tool that we have available in LogRhythm, but this doesn't have to be done within this particular dashboard. And as we go through, we're going to add more notes and evidence to the case. So we could also, from this point on, look at our network traffic. So again, going back to our idea as to where to focus our efforts on, we could either focus on network or host data. So we're going to use Network Monitor, which, again, cheap kind of shot, but Network Monitor is available for free if you don't already have it. So you do have access to a free download of Network Monitor and just look at network traffics in your organization. So we might look at trend data, and what we're actually filtering on here is just traffic, SMB traffic going backs and forwards between our suspect machine and our domain controller. And as we have a closer look, we'll look around that same time zone as to what we're investigating, so from the time of when PS-exec was executed. And what we see here is a bunch of different SMB commands. SMB is the server message block protocol that it's used and it has been used for many, many years on traditional Windows networks. So why might this be useful? Because there are certain SMB commands that would essentially allude to whether certain volume or file or folder data on a remote system has been enumerated. So this kind of ties in again with kind of understanding your network. And if you're not sure, or if you've never heard of SMB, I would, or just any particular protocol that you might be looking up, I would definitely look at kind of digging up the articles or the RFCs for that particular protocol, and kind of having a closer look, because they will reveal a lot of information about, you know, underlying transportation of network data and so on. So what we see in this screen is actually from our network monitor drill down, we actually see quite a lot of output in the file name metadata field within our SMB traffic. And you know, this looks quite nasty, but kind of drilling in a bit, if we kind of focus in on these areas a little bit closer, what we can see here is we see process IDs starting up on our suspicious sysadmin machine, again in reference to PS.exec. And we also see an Lsass.dmp file, which again would be in you know, anyone that's investigating or hunting for this activity. You know, if you haven't started out looking for lsass.dump, but you started looking at PS.exec, this is probably going to be quite interesting, because this would potentially suggest that, you know, this LSASS service has had its process memory dumped from the domain controller remotely from a sysadmin machine. So again, benign, but we can glean quite a lot of information just from looking at the network data, as well as from some of the generic Windows security and Sysmon event logs. So again, kind of looking at the network monitor SMB traffic within the web console dashboard this time. So if we didn't have access to the network monitor dashboard, maybe it's a different team that manages the network traffic side of things, then we can still get that same information from the web console. And as we can see, it's pretty much the same information. And if we wanted to, we can actually pull down the PCAP file for that SMB flow. We also have MAC addresses to confirm those two machines in question. And so connecting the dots so far, I've kind of covered this mostly, but we have some unusual process activity, or potentially unusual process activity. Could be generic, you know, benign troubleshooting type of activity, and various SMB commands. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go backwards in time. And again, you know, from an investigation, that could have potentially been the end of the investigation, but we're going to carry on hunting and figure out, you know, well, what else was this particular machine or user, sysadmin user, doing? So this time we're going to go backwards by 4 hours. And this goes back to where our understanding our bottom and top X and trend and baselines of our network. So again, what we're seeing here is where, rather than looking for top occurrences, we're looking for bottom occurrences, because typically if an attack, and not always, but typically for a successful attack, you may only see one occurrence. You're not going to see the same attack millions of times, unless, for example, it's a distributed denial of service attack. So one thing that stands out in particular here is we already know that CMD and PS.exec executable commands are kind of part of what we've unraveled so far. But we also see a printer setup file being executed against the domain controller, which seems a little bit strange. So we'll carry on digging and using the good old Windows security event logs. What we find is another confirmation of not only the IP addresses but port numbers, and again, all that can be helped. All that can help your hunting by collecting all of that data from either network monitor or web console. And actually, this particular Windows event ID 5156 is really quite useful, because it will tell you the particular process name that tried to execute or did execute on a particular machine. So again, we get process IDs, and looking at the Sysmon raw event ID for this particular activity, what we see is that the printer setup x86 exe is actually, according to the Sysmon data, and Sysmon, if you're not using Sysmon, you definitely should be, because you just get so much extra rich information from Sysmon logs. And there's been a lot of talk and presentations about Sysmon over recent years. But what we see here is we see an attacker tool called Mimikatz, which is very well and kind of widely talked about attacker tool used to dump creds and do all sorts of attacks. on a Active Directory domain. What we could also do is, sorry, going back a slide, we can use the file hash to then go and punch into VirusTotal manually. We should never upload a file to VirusTotal unless we're absolutely sure what it contains. But just doing a quick validation of VirusTotal, we can see again that it's Mimikatz, so it's definitely not Sysmon incorrectly reporting our log data. And it's always worthwhile checking and kind of cross-checking, different sources for validation reasons. We could also do that automatically using SmartResponse, so we could also check our file name automatically or manually using the inspector pane on the right-hand side of the web console. So potentially what we could be dealing with here, the fact that we know that the sysadmin was potentially, or at least we thought at the beginning that they were potentially doing some remote troubleshooting exercise, but the fact that now Mimikatz is involved potentially might suggest that there's either some sort of attack on the Active Directory domain controller. And from what we understand about golden ticket evidence, and this if you haven't heard of it, the AD Security website is a really good source of information. Attack MITRE Matrix also has similar kind of information about certain attack types as well. But from what we have documented here, certain evidence would suggest a golden ticket attack as an example, and there are lots of different ways in which Mimikatz can be used to, attack a domain controller or a domain in general. So we're going to focus on specifically golden ticket attacks, and actually, again, kind of talking about unraveling and how the story unfolds. This can help at this point have can kind of bring about further hypotheses for the future. So next time around, we might decide to target golden tickets specifically. But in terms of what we understand about golden tickets, we know that the account domain field should be a short name for both event ID 4624 and 4672. So looking at those particular event IDs, the one on the left 4624 and the one on the right 4672, we can see that we do have the short name for our test domain here, AC. So actually we don't kind of fit the criteria, so maybe it wasn't suspicious, but we'll carry on digging anyway. And what we find is that in our event ID 4624, we actually see the user administrator. So typically the administrator account would be used to, in order to do a DC sync command using the Mimikatz or some other operation within the Mimikatz. So this is just a different validation, and it's also a good example of never solely relying on third-party information, because tools get updated, attacker tools get updated regularly, particularly when they're open sourced or they're listed on GitHub. There's lots of contributors to those tools. So definitely look and try and do internal testing if you can, because this will help you to decipher how this would look in your environment and not particularly just a more generic environment. So we see some validation of logon type freeze, which is a network logon, and again, just a quick view of trend administrator logon type of data, understanding who logs into your domain controllers over periods of time can help to kind of unravel other potentially malicious activity. What we could also do is, taking it one step further, is if you're not sure at this stage, if you don't solely want to rely on event IDs and so on, is you could even dump your Kerberos keys and use Wireshark to decrypt it, for example. So, kind of thinking outside the box and trying to really understand the network traffic that goes on. Just kind of wrapping up this example real quick. So going back to Network Monitor, we also see some further activities, some files or some sort of website being connected to from this same computer. So we're kind of going back in time from when PSExec was run. Turns out to be a file upload/download website. So potentially that's where they pulled down Mimikatz from. We could, again, go backwards and forwards in time, depending on what we're looking for. In this screen, we decide to look for particular authentication activities. And again, this kind of all helps to know, what's normal versus what's not normal. And what we ultimately find is we find more commands being run, so WMIC, which is used for domain enumeration, net commands, and so on. So there seems to be a bunch of different commands being executed, before the kind of the main attack, so to speak, was carried out. And again, we can kind of carry on forensically going through this, collecting process IDs, hashes, event IDs, timestamps, and just generally building out your timeline. And all this can be done, as I say, within Web Console. It can also be done within the Network Monitor dashboard. It can also be done as of 7.3 of a LogRhythm. It can also be done with Kibana. And I just kind of want to draw that point that, if you're not a LogRhythm customer, you can collect and analyze your data even without any of these tools or dashboards available. It's just going to make your life a lot more tricky. And kind of last point really, so once you've kind of potentially found some malicious activity, or even if you haven't, you could look at ways to implement SmartResponse or auto remediation. So perhaps killing a particular process, locking an account, doing a remote memory dump of a machine or process, for instance, or even isolating network traffic by adding a network firewall ACL. If you're particularly using third-party endpoint monitoring and detection solutions like Carbon Black, for instance. Lots that can be done with PowerShell and automation. And also, again, going back to our trend analysis and trend detection, you can also look for baselines compared with lifetimes. For instance, in this example for PSExec and Mimikatz, we could then go and write a rule looking for, logons to our domain controller and being able to alert us for future detections or potential future detections of malicious activity outside of hours or anything that looks out of the ordinary. And also, again, we could build out different types of rule blocks for, either scenarios that are observed or not observed, and basically specific patterns of process execution. And just a last point, there's a bunch of different event IDs. These are kind of documented in various places, but the idea behind this slide is really just to point out that even if you didn't necessarily find anything suspicious, you're instantly building out your internal knowledge base of your organization and network traffic. And I think I'll pass back over to Laura now. I've done way too much talking, so over to you, Laura.
Not at all. It was really interesting. A lot of content to cover, AC, and I think I didn't want to interrupt you to do any questions and whatnot, because what you were discussing was so interesting. So I think we've pretty much run out of time. We're not going to do the vote. We might have time for one question, because there's been quite a few questions submitted. So I think we've got time for one. And I'm going to ask you, I'm just going to select one. What's the difference between traditional instant response and investigations versus threat hunting?
Yeah, so it's really hard to define specifically, but there are obviously I've kind of touched on some of the points. So there's very much a change of mindset of as I said right at the beginning, being proactive versus reactive. Thinking more like the adversary rather than just solely a defender. Also, from an incident response point of view, potentially, there may be some chain of custody or, potentially even legal involvement if you're trying to catch a perpetrator or an insider, an insider threat that maybe they're up to no good. Maybe they're doing some sort of insider trading, for instance, and maybe that, maybe that incident response process has to collect log data for, potentially presenting that data in a court of law. So hunting, and can go down that route as well, but hunting is just more about the mindset and the approach and the methodology and kind of more, just kind of merging the two mindsets of attacker versus defender together.
All right. Excellent. Well, we have reached the top of the hour, and it's been a really interesting session. Thank you so much for your time, AC, and thank you to everybody who joined today. I'm sorry we don't have time for any questions. If you can get in touch with us, should you have any, and we're going to be sending the slides out afterwards as well with some interesting with a white paper in an email afterwards. So thank you again, everybody. And we're going to end the presentation now. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, AC.